Pirates. Everything you know about them is a lie. They weren't free spirits chasing treasure and living romantic adventures on the high seas. They were stinking, diseased wretches locked in a constant dance with death, desperation, and degradation. Tonight we're diving into the real pirate life that Hollywood will never show you. The one that reeks of human waste, rotting flesh, and broken dreams. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The golden age of piracy, roughly spanning from 1650 to 1730, has been romanticized beyond recognition by centuries of literature, films, and folklore. When most people picture a pirate, they see Johnny Depp's swaggering Jack Sparrow, charming, witty, and impeccably dressed, despite months at sea. They imagine treasure maps, parrot companions, and heroic sword fights under tropical sunsets. The reality was so far removed from this fantasy that if you could transport yourself back to a real pirate ship, you'd likely vomit within minutes and beg to be put ashore anywhere, even a deserted island. The truth about pirate life begins with understanding who these men actually were. They weren't born into piracy with dreams of adventure. Most were desperate souls who had run out of options. Former naval sailors who had been cheated of their pay, merchant seamen who had survived shipwrecks only to find themselves stranded and penniless, escaped convicts, runaway indentured servants, and men fleeing debt or prosecution. Some were pressed into service, essentially kidnapped and forced to join pirate crews whether they wanted to or not. These weren't romantic rebels choosing freedom over convention. They were broken men choosing a horrific existence over an even worse one. The ships themselves were floating disasters, masquerading as vessels. While movies show sleek, well-maintained galleons, cutting gracefully through azure waters, real pirate ships were typically stolen merchant vessels, captured naval ships, or hastily constructed craft that were barely seaworthy. Pirates didn't have the luxury of dry docks, professional shipwrights, or quality materials for repairs. When something broke, and things broke constantly, it was patched with whatever was available: canvas, rope, pieces of wood from other parts of the ship, or materials scavenged from victims. The moment you stepped aboard a pirate ship, your senses would be assaulted by a combination of odors so foul that many new crew members spent their first days continuously vomiting. The smell was a nauseating cocktail of human excrement, rotting food, stagnant bilge water, unwashed bodies, and death. Pirates had no concept of hygiene. As we understand it, fresh water was too precious to waste on bathing. And even if it weren't, there were no facilities for washing. Men wore the same clothes for months or even years until they literally fell apart. Their bodies were encrusted with salt, sweat, grime, and worse. The ship's hull was constantly taking on water. This was simply a fact of life. With wooden vessels, especially those that had been damaged in battles or poorly maintained, the bilge, the lowest part of the ship where this water collected, became a festering soup of seawater, mixed with human waste, food scraps, rat droppings, and anything else that fell or was thrown down there. Crew members had to take turns working the pumps to keep the ship from sinking, meaning they were regularly exposed to this toxic brew. The smell of the bilge permeated everything on the ship, seeping into the wood, the sails, and the men's clothing and skin. Sleep was a luxury that few pirates enjoyed. Most crews operated on a watch system, meaning men worked in shifts around the clock. When they weren't on duty, they slept wherever they could find space, often on the hard deck with nothing but a thin piece of canvas for warmth. There were no proper beds, no mattresses, no privacy. Men slept pressed against each other for warmth, sharing their body heat as well as their parasites, diseases, and the stench of their unwashed bodies. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Everything was done in full view of the crew: eating, sleeping, relieving yourself and dying. The popular image of pirates wearing elaborate costumes with tricorn hats, flowing coats, and polished boots is pure fantasy. Most pirates wore whatever they could find, steal, or trade for. Clothing was patched and repatched until it was more patch than original fabric. Many went barefoot because shoes were a luxury they couldn't afford to replace when they wore out. Those who did have footwear often wore mismatched items, scavenged from different sources. The famous pirate hat was usually just whatever headwear was available to protect against the sun, and in many cases men simply went bareheaded and suffered the consequences of constant sun exposure. The weapons that pirates carried were not the gleaming cutlasses and ornate pistols of movie fame. Most were armed with whatever they could acquire: rusty swords, crude knives, antiquated firearms that were as likely to explode in their hands as fire properly, and improvised weapons made from ship parts. Gunpowder was expensive and often damp from the ship's conditions, making firearms unreliable. Many pirates relied on intimidation rather than actual fighting skill, because few had formal training in combat. They were more likely to die from infection caused by a small cut than from a dramatic sword duel. The myth of buried treasure is perhaps the most persistent and false aspect of pirate lore. Pirates didn't bury treasure because they didn't have treasure to bury. Most pirate attacks yielded little of value. Perhaps some trade goods, food supplies, or small amounts of currency. The idea of chests full of gold doubloons comes from a few exceptional cases that were wildly exaggerated over time. Most pirates lived hand to mouth, spending whatever they acquired as quickly as possible on necessities like food, water, and ship repairs. The average pirate was more likely to steal a bag of grain than a chest of jewels. When pirates did manage to capture valuable cargo, it was usually divided among the crew, according to a predetermined agreement, with the captain and officers receiving larger shares. But even these windfalls were temporary. Pirates had no safe places to store wealth, no banks to use, and no legitimate way to convert stolen goods into usable currency. They were essentially homeless criminals living on a floating prison of their own making. The romantic notion of pirates as rebels fighting against oppressive governments is also largely fictional. While some pirates did attack ships from nations they considered enemies, most were simply opportunistic criminals who attacked whatever target seemed profitable, regardless of nationality. They weren't freedom fighters or revolutionaries. They were desperate men committing acts of violence to survive another day. Many pirate crews were multinational groups with no political agenda beyond basic survival. The famous pirate code that movies love to reference was less a noble set of principles and more a basic set of rules designed to prevent the crew from killing each other before they could complete their criminal enterprises. These rules covered practical matters like the division of loot, the punishment for desertion, and protocols for making decisions. They weren't based on honor or justice. They were survival mechanisms for groups of violent, desperate men forced to live in close quarters. Democracy among pirates was not the enlightened self-governance that modern interpretations suggest. Pirate crews often elected their captains, but this was usually because they needed someone expendable to take responsibility when things went wrong. Captains could be voted out or even executed by their crews if they failed to deliver results, or if the crew decided they needed a scapegoat. The position of pirate captain was less a mark of respect and more a death sentence with a temporary delay. Perhaps most importantly, the life expectancy of a pirate was measured in months, not years. Most died within 2 years of joining a crew. They didn't retire to tropical islands with their fortunes. They died of disease, violence, starvation, drowning, or execution. Those who managed to survive longer often did so by abandoning piracy and fleeing to remote locations where they lived in poverty and constant fear of discovery. The ships themselves were death traps. Wooden vessels in the age of sail were inherently dangerous. But pirate ships were exponentially more so because of poor maintenance, overloading, and the violent lifestyle of their crews. Fires were a constant threat. One spark could turn the entire ship into an inferno within minutes. The presence of gunpowder made this even more dangerous, as explosions could tear a ship apart instantly. Pirates lived with the knowledge that their vessel could become their tomb at any moment, whether from enemy action, natural disaster, or simple mechanical failure. As we prepare to delve deeper into the specific horrors of pirate life, it's important to understand that what we're about to explore isn't an adventure story or a tale of rebellion against authority. It's a chronicle of human misery, desperation, and the lengths to which people will go when they have no other options. The men who chose piracy weren't heroes or romantics. They were survivors clinging to life in circumstances so dire that a floating hell seemed preferable to whatever they were fleeing on land. The physical reality of a pirate ship was a nightmare that defied every romantic notion ever conceived about life at sea. These vessels were floating sewers, disease incubators, and death traps, all rolled into one cramped, stinking package. To understand the true horror of pirate existence, you must first grasp the environment in which these desperate men were forced to live, work, sleep, eat, and inevitably die. A typical pirate ship ranged from 60 to 100 feet in length, which might sound spacious until you consider that this confined space had to accommodate anywhere from 50 to 300 men, along with their weapons, supplies, stolen goods, and all the necessities required to keep a vessel operational at sea. Every square inch was utilized, and privacy was not just rare, it was completely non-existent. Men lived on top of each other in conditions that would make a modern prison seem luxurious by comparison. The main deck, where most daily activities took place, was a chaos of ropes, barrels, cannons, and human bodies. During storms or battles, this space became a deadly obstacle course where a single misstep could result in serious injury or death. The deck was constantly wet from sea spray, rain, or the various liquids that crew members spilled, vomited, or expelled from their bodies. This moisture never fully dried, creating a perpetually slippery surface that reeked of salt, decay, and human waste. Below deck, conditions deteriorated from merely unpleasant to absolutely hellish. The gun deck, where the ship's cannons were housed, doubled as living quarters for much of the crew. Men slept between the massive iron weapons, using cannonballs as pillows and coils of rope as makeshift bedding. During battle, these same spaces filled with choking gun smoke, deafening noise, and the screams of wounded men. The wooden walls were stained black with gunpowder residue and splattered with blood that had soaked so deep into the wood that it could never be cleaned away. The hold, the lowest accessible part of the ship, was where supplies were stored. Or at least where supplies were supposed to be stored. In reality, this space was often flooded with bilge water, a toxic mixture of seawater, human excrement, rotting food, and decomposing organic matter. The bilge water was supposed to be pumped out regularly, but pirates often lacked the discipline or manpower to maintain this essential task consistently. As a result, the hold frequently contained several feet of this putrid liquid, which sloshed back and forth with the ship's movement, creating a nauseating symphony of splashing sewage. Rats thrived in these conditions, multiplying at an alarming rate and becoming a constant menace to both supplies and crew. These rodents weren't just numerous. They were aggressive, disease-carrying pests that would attack sleeping men, gnaw through rope and wood, and contaminate food stores. Pirates would find rat droppings in their meals, rat bites on their bodies, and rat corpses floating in their drinking water. Some crews resorted to eating the rats themselves when other food sources ran low, but even this desperate measure was dangerous, as the rodents carried numerous diseases that could prove fatal to humans. The ship's structure itself was constantly deteriorating. Wooden vessels required constant maintenance to remain seaworthy. But pirates rarely had access to proper shipyards, quality materials, or skilled craftsmen. Instead, they performed crude repairs using whatever materials they could find or steal. Gaps in the hull were stuffed with rags, oakum, or pieces of canvas. Broken masts were splinted with scavenged wood and held together with makeshift rope binding. Sails were patched so extensively that some resembled patchwork quilts more than functional maritime equipment. Water was constantly seeping through these inadequate repairs, and the ship's pumps, if they were working at all, struggled to keep pace with the influx. Many pirate ships sailed with several inches of water sloshing around the lower decks at all times, creating perfect breeding conditions for bacteria, parasites, and disease. This water was ice cold in northern waters and stagnant and warm in tropical regions, but it was always filthy and dangerous to human health. The lack of proper ventilation made conditions even worse. Most pirate ships had few windows or openings below deck, which meant that fresh air rarely circulated through the living spaces. The air below deck was thick, humid, and laden with the accumulated odors of unwashed human bodies, rotting food, human waste, gunpowder residue, and the musty smell of wet wood and canvas. Men would emerge from below deck gasping for fresh air, only to find that even the supposedly clean sea air was often tainted by the ship's pervasive stench. Lighting below deck was provided by candles or oil lamps, which created additional hazards in an environment already saturated with flammable materials. Pirates lived in constant fear of fire, knowing that a single overturned flame could turn their ship into a floating funeral pyre within minutes. The wooden walls, dried by salt air and soaked in pitch and tar for waterproofing, would burn with explosive intensity. Many pirate ships were lost to fires that started from simple accidents: a dropped candle, a poorly maintained lantern, or sparks from the galley. The galley, where food was prepared, was typically nothing more than a small area with a brick-lined firebox called a caboose. This primitive cooking area was dangerous, inefficient, and completely inadequate for feeding large crews. The fire had to be carefully controlled to prevent it from spreading to the rest of the ship, which meant that food was often undercooked or cooked unevenly. The smoke from the galley fire had nowhere to go except up through the ship, filling the already toxic air with additional pollutants. Storage of food and water presented enormous challenges. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels that quickly developed leaks, allowing seawater to contaminate the supply. The barrels themselves became breeding grounds for algae, bacteria, and various forms of marine life. Pirates would often find their drinking water green with algae, squirming with worms, or so foul-smelling that they could barely force themselves to consume it. Yet they had no choice. Dehydration at sea meant certain death. Food storage was equally problematic. Meat was preserved with salt, but the salt itself was often contaminated with impurities that could make people sick. Vegetables and fruits rotted quickly in the humid conditions, and grain stores were constantly under attack from rats and insects. Pirates would often find their food supplies crawling with maggots, weevils, and other vermin. The line between edible and inedible became increasingly blurred as voyages stretched on and supplies dwindled. The sleeping arrangements on pirate ships defied all concepts of comfort and hygiene. Most crew members slept wherever they could find space, often on the hard wooden deck with nothing more than a piece of canvas or a coil of rope for bedding. Men slept pressed against each other for warmth, sharing not only body heat but also lice, fleas, and whatever diseases their bunkmates might be carrying. The concept of personal space was completely foreign. Pirates might wake up to find strangers sleeping on top of them, or discover that someone had vomited, urinated, or worse during the night. Some ships had hammocks, but these were considered luxuries and were usually reserved for officers or more experienced crew members. Even hammocks offered little comfort, as they were often made from rough canvas that chafed the skin and provided minimal protection from the cold. The hammocks were hung so close together that men could barely turn over without disturbing their neighbors, and the constant swaying of the ship made sleep difficult even under the best circumstances. Personal belongings were virtually impossible to maintain in these conditions. Pirates owned little to begin with, and what they did have was constantly at risk of being stolen, damaged by water, or destroyed by the harsh conditions. Clothes rotted off their bodies, metal tools rusted away, and any paper items, letters, documents, or books, quickly turned to pulp in the humid environment. Most pirates carried their few possessions in small bags or boxes that they kept close to their bodies at all times, knowing that leaving anything unattended was tantamount to throwing it away. The ship's rigging, the complex system of ropes, pulleys, and sails that enabled the vessel to move, was constantly breaking down and requiring repair. Pirates spent much of their time climbing high into the rigging to toss sails, repair damage, or keep watch for other ships. This work was extremely dangerous, especially in rough weather, and many pirates died from falls that could have been prevented with proper safety equipment. The rigging itself was often made from substandard rope that was prone to breaking under stress, creating additional hazards for anyone working aloft. Weapons storage presented another set of problems. Gunpowder had to be kept dry, but this was nearly impossible in the humid conditions of a ship at sea. Damp gunpowder was useless in battle and dangerous to handle, as it could explode unpredictably or fail to ignite when needed. Metal weapons rusted quickly in the salt air, becoming dull, brittle, and unreliable. Pirates spent considerable time maintaining their weapons, but even with constant care, their arms were often in poor condition when they needed them most. The ship's navigation equipment was equally unreliable. Compasses could be thrown off by the iron cannons and other metal objects on the ship. Charts were often inaccurate, outdated, or damaged by water. Many pirate crews relied on dead reckoning, essentially educated guessing, to find their way across the ocean. This led to frequent incidents of ships becoming lost, running aground, or sailing into dangerous waters without warning. Waste disposal was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of shipboard life. There were no toilets as we understand them. Pirates relieved themselves wherever they could, often simply hanging over the side of the ship. This practice, known as using the heads, the front part of the ship, was dangerous in rough weather and impossible during storms. As a result, human waste accumulated throughout the ship, creating health hazards and contributing to the overwhelming stench that characterized these vessels. The psychological impact of living in such conditions cannot be overstated. Men who might have maintained some standards of cleanliness and behavior on land quickly devolved into something barely recognizable as civilized human beings. The constant filth, stench, and degradation wore away at their humanity, turning them into desperate creatures focused solely on survival. The ship became not just their workplace and home, but their entire world. A world that was actively trying to kill them every single day. The question of food and water aboard a pirate ship wasn't about cuisine or comfort. It was about survival in its most desperate form. Every meal was a gamble with death. Every drink a potential poison. And every day without adequate nutrition brought pirates closer to a slow, agonizing demise from starvation or disease. The romantic notion of pirates feasting on tropical fruits and fresh fish while anchored in hidden coves was pure fantasy. The reality was a nightmare of rotten meat, contaminated water, and cannibalistic desperation that would drive modern people to madness. Water, the most basic necessity of human life, was perhaps the greatest challenge facing any crew at sea. Pirates had no reliable method of water purification, no refrigeration, and no way to produce fresh water from seawater. They were entirely dependent on whatever water they could carry in wooden barrels, and these supplies were constantly threatened by leakage, contamination, and simple evaporation. A typical pirate ship might carry enough water for 2 to 3 weeks under ideal conditions, but ideal conditions were rare at sea. The wooden barrels used to store water were crude constructions that leaked constantly. The wood would swell and shrink with changes in temperature and humidity, creating gaps that allowed precious fresh water to escape and seawater to seep in. Pirates would often discover that their water supply had become brackish or completely contaminated with salt water, making it undrinkable. Even worse, the barrels themselves became breeding grounds for algae, bacteria, and various forms of marine life that could make the water deadly to consume. Water that had been stored for more than a few days would develop a green, slimy coating, and an odor so foul that it could make even hardened pirates gag. The water would often be thick with algae squirming with worms and contaminated with rat droppings and other organic matter that had found its way into the barrels. Pirates would strain this water through cloth to remove the larger chunks of contamination, but this did nothing to eliminate the microscopic organisms that caused disease and death. When water supplies ran critically low, pirates would resort to increasingly desperate measures to obtain liquid. They would collect rainwater in whatever containers they could find. But tropical downpours were unpredictable and often came during storms when it was impossible to collect water safely. They would try to extract moisture from captured supplies, squeezing liquid from fruits and vegetables that were already rotting. In the most extreme cases, they would resort to drinking their own urine or the blood of animals they had killed, practices that often hastened their deaths rather than prolonging their lives. The food situation was equally horrific. Pirates carried 3 basic types of provisions: hardtack, salt pork, and whatever they could steal or forage along the way. Hardtack was a type of biscuit made from flour and water that was baked until it was rock hard. These biscuits could last for months without spoiling, but they were nearly inedible when fresh and became absolutely revolting with age. Pirates would often find their hardtack infested with weevils, maggots, and other insects that had burrowed into the dense bread. The standard practice was to tap the hardtack against a hard surface to knock out the larger bugs, then eat it anyway. Salt pork was supposed to provide protein, but the preservation process was often inadequate, and the meat would begin to rot despite being heavily salted. Pirates would cut away the obviously spoiled portions and eat what remained, even when it was green with mold or crawling with maggots. The salt itself was often contaminated with impurities that could cause illness, and the meat was so heavily salted that it was barely edible even when fresh. Pirates would sometimes soak salt pork in seawater to try to remove some of the salt, but this often made the meat even more dangerous to consume. Fruits and vegetables were luxuries that pirates could rarely afford to carry. Fresh produce would rot within days in the humid conditions of a ship at sea, and there was no way to preserve it effectively. When pirates did manage to steal fresh food from their victims, they would consume it immediately, often gorging themselves to the point of sickness because they knew the food wouldn't last. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant that pirates were constantly on the verge of developing scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that would literally cause their bodies to fall apart. The cooking facilities aboard pirate ships were primitive and dangerous. Most ships had a small brick-lined firebox called a caboose, where all food preparation took place. This fire had to be carefully controlled to prevent it from spreading to the rest of the ship, which meant that food was often undercooked or cooked unevenly. Pirates would often eat raw or partially cooked meat because it was too dangerous to maintain a cooking fire for extended periods. The water used for cooking was the same contaminated, foul-smelling liquid the crew drank. Stews and soups would be prepared with green, wormy water, and the heat of cooking would often make the smell so intense that crew members would vomit while trying to eat. The cooking pots themselves were rarely cleaned properly, and layers of grease, food particles, and bacteria would build up over time, creating a toxic environment for food preparation. Rats were a constant menace to food supplies, but they also became food themselves when other provisions ran low. Pirates would catch and eat rats, knowing full well that these animals were disease-carrying pests that fed on garbage and human waste. Rat meat was tough, stringy, and often infected with parasites, but desperate men would consume anything that might provide nutrition. The irony was that the rats were often healthier than the humans trying to eat them, having access to a more varied diet of stolen food scraps. When food supplies ran dangerously low, pirate crews would resort to increasingly desperate measures. They would boil leather items like belts and shoes to extract any possible nutrition. They would chew on rope and canvas, hoping to find some edible substance. They would eat sawdust, paper, and anything else that might provide bulk to fill their empty stomachs. These practices often caused more harm than good, as indigestible materials could cause intestinal blockages or poisoning. The most horrifying aspect of food scarcity was the turn to cannibalism. When all other options had been exhausted, pirate crews would sometimes resort to consuming their own dead. This wasn't done lightly or without ceremony. It was a desperate act of survival that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. Pirates would draw lots to determine who would be killed and eaten, or they would wait for crew members to die naturally and then divide the corpse among the living. The meat would be cooked and distributed like any other food, but the psychological toll of eating human flesh was devastating. The process of cannibalism was methodical and horrifying. Pirates would carefully portion out the body, often saving certain organs that they believed had medicinal properties. The meat would be salted and dried like any other protein, and crew members would force themselves to consume it to avoid starvation. Many pirates who survived such experiences reported that they could never forget the taste and smell of human flesh, and that it haunted their dreams for years afterward. Even when food was available, meal times aboard pirate ships were far from civilized affairs. Pirates ate with their hands or crude utensils, sharing bowls and plates that were rarely washed. Food was consumed quickly and defensively, as leaving a meal unattended meant that other crew members would steal it. There was no concept of table manners or social dining. Meals were feeding frenzies where the strongest and most aggressive pirates claimed the best portions while weaker crew members made do with scraps. The lack of proper nutrition had devastating effects on pirate health. Scurvy was virtually universal among crews that had been at sea for more than a few months. This disease caused teeth to fall out, gums to bleed constantly, old wounds to reopen, and bones to become brittle and prone to fracture. Pirates would develop massive bruises from minor injuries, and their skin would take on a yellowish, mottled appearance. The final stages of scurvy involved delirium, organ failure, and death. Malnutrition also made pirates vulnerable to every other disease and infection they encountered. Their immune systems were constantly compromised, making them easy targets for typhoid, dysentery, and other illnesses that could spread rapidly through a malnourished crew. Many pirates died not from violence or accidents, but from diseases that their weakened bodies couldn't fight off. The psychological effects of constant hunger and poor nutrition were equally devastating. Malnourished pirates became irritable, paranoid, and prone to violence. They would fight over scraps of rotten food, steal from each other constantly, and form alliances based solely on access to better rations. The social structure of pirate crews was often determined more by who controlled the food supply than by traditional concepts of leadership or authority. Pirates would sometimes resort to attacking other ships not for treasure, but simply for food and water. They would kill entire crews to claim supplies that might keep them alive for a few more days. The desperation for nutrition turned pirates into monsters who would commit any atrocity for the chance to eat one more meal or drink one more cup of clean water. The irony of pirate food culture was that these men who supposedly lived free and adventurous lives were actually prisoners of their own desperate hunger. They were constantly searching for their next meal, constantly worried about their water supply, and constantly aware that starvation was stalking them. The romantic image of pirates feasting and celebrating their victories was pure fiction. The reality was a group of malnourished, desperate men fighting over scraps of rotten food while slowly dying of diseases caused by their inadequate diet. The end result was that most pirates died not from sword fights or cannon fire, but from the slow, grinding effects of malnutrition and starvation. They would waste away gradually, their bodies consuming their own muscle and organs in a desperate attempt to survive. Death from starvation was a prolonged, agonizing process that could take weeks or months, during which the victim remained conscious and aware of their deteriorating condition until the very end. Disease aboard a pirate ship wasn't just an occupational hazard. It was a guaranteed death sentence that stalked every crew member from the moment they stepped on board. The combination of malnutrition, contaminated water, poor sanitation, overcrowding, and complete lack of medical knowledge created the perfect storm for every imaginable illness. Pirates didn't die heroically in battles or dramatic shipwrecks. They died slowly, painfully, and in the most degrading circumstances possible, their bodies literally rotting away while they were still alive. Scurvy was perhaps the most iconic and horrifying disease associated with maritime life, and pirates suffered from it in its most extreme forms. This disease, caused by a complete lack of vitamin C in the diet, would begin to manifest after just a few weeks at sea. The first symptoms were seemingly minor: fatigue, irritability, and joint pain, that pirates would dismiss as normal consequences of their harsh lifestyle. But scurvy was just getting started, and what followed was a systematic destruction of the human body that was both grotesque and inevitable. As scurvy progressed, pirates would notice their gums beginning to swell and bleed. At first, this might seem like a minor inconvenience, but the bleeding quickly became constant and severe. Pirates would wake up with their mouths full of blood, unable to eat solid food without excruciating pain. Their teeth would begin to loosen in their sockets, eventually falling out one by one, leaving behind infected, gaping wounds that never healed properly. Many pirates lost all their teeth within months of developing scurvy, forcing them to subsist on liquid foods that were often just as contaminated as their solid rations. The bleeding didn't stop with the gums. Scurvy caused blood vessels throughout the body to become fragile and rupture at the slightest provocation. Pirates would develop massive bruises from minor bumps or even from sleeping on hard surfaces. These bruises would spread and darken, covering large portions of their bodies with purple and black discoloration that made them look like walking corpses. Old wounds would spontaneously reopen, bleeding freely and refusing to heal. New injuries, no matter how minor, would become gaping sores that festered and spread. Perhaps most horrifying of all, scurvy would cause old, healed fractures to break apart again. Bones that had been broken years earlier would suddenly snap without warning, leaving pirates with multiple fractures that had no hope of healing properly. The pain was indescribable. Imagine every bone in your body becoming brittle as glass while you're trapped on a ship that's constantly moving and jolting through rough seas. Pirates with advanced scurvy would often beg their crewmates to kill them rather than endure another day of agony. The final stages of scurvy involved complete systemic collapse. Pirates would develop massive internal bleeding. Their organs would begin to fail, and they would slip into delirium before finally dying in pools of their own blood. The disease could take months to kill, during which time the victim remained conscious and aware of their deteriorating condition. There was no cure, no treatment, and no hope. Only a slow, agonizing descent into death. Dysentery was another common killer aboard pirate ships, and it spread through crews like wildfire. Due to the appalling sanitary conditions, this disease caused severe diarrhea, often bloody, that would continue for weeks until the victim died of dehydration and blood loss. Pirates with dysentery would lose control of their bowels completely. soiling themselves constantly and adding to the already overwhelming stench of the ship. The disease was highly contagious, spread through contaminated food and water, and there was no way to prevent its transmission in the close quarters of a ship. The symptoms of dysentery were both disgusting and debilitating. Pirates would experience violent stomach cramps that would double them over in pain, followed by explosive diarrhea that often contained blood, mucus, and pieces of intestinal lining. They would become severely dehydrated, their skin taking on a grayish, papery appearance as their bodies desperately tried to conserve what little fluid remained. Many pirates with dysentery would drink seawater in their desperation for liquid, which only accelerated their death by adding salt poisoning to their list of ailments. The psychological effects of dysentery were almost as devastating as the physical symptoms. Pirates would become delirious from dehydration and blood loss, often seeing hallucinations or becoming violently paranoid. They would accuse their crewmates of poisoning them or plotting against them, leading to fights and violence even as they were dying. The constant loss of bodily control was deeply humiliating for men who prized their toughness and independence, and many dysentery victims would isolate themselves from the crew, crawling into dark corners of the ship to die alone rather than face the shame of their condition. Typhoid fever was another deadly disease that thrived in the unsanitary conditions of pirate ships. This bacterial infection would begin with what seemed like a minor fever and headache, but would quickly progress to severe symptoms that killed most victims within weeks. Pirates with typhoid would develop high fevers that could reach dangerous levels, causing them to become delirious and sometimes violent. They would break out in rose-colored spots across their chest and abdomen, and many would develop severe diarrhea that further weakened their already compromised systems. The fever associated with typhoid was particularly dangerous aboard ships where there was no way to cool down overheated patients. Pirates would burn with fever while surrounded by shipmates who were powerless to help them. They would thrash about in delirium, often injuring themselves or others in their fevered state. The disease was highly contagious, spread through contaminated food and water, and could wipe out entire crews within weeks of the first case appearing. Smallpox, when it appeared on pirate ships, was absolutely devastating. This viral disease would cause high fevers, severe headaches, and a distinctive rash that would progress to fluid-filled pustules covering the entire body. The pustules would eventually burst, leaving behind deep scars that marked survivors for life, assuming they survived at all. Smallpox had a mortality rate of around 30% under ideal conditions, but aboard pirate ships where medical care was non-existent and nutrition was poor, the death rate was much higher. Pirates with smallpox would become covered in painful sores that made any movement agony. They would develop fevers so high that they would slip into comas or become violently delirious. The disease was extremely contagious, and there was no way to quarantine sick crew members on a crowded ship. When smallpox appeared, it would often kill half the crew or more, leaving the survivors too weak and traumatized to continue their piratical activities. Yellow fever, common in tropical waters where many pirates operated, was perhaps the most feared disease of all. This mosquito-borne illness would begin with flu-like symptoms that seemed relatively minor, but would quickly progress to liver failure, internal bleeding, and death. The disease got its name from the yellow discoloration that victims would develop as their livers failed, and bile backed up into their bloodstream. Pirates with yellow fever would vomit blood constantly, earning the disease its nickname Black Vomit, due to the dark color of the blood after it had been partially digested. They would develop high fevers, severe headaches, and would often become delirious in their final days. The disease had a mortality rate of around 50%, and those who survived were often left with permanent liver damage and other health problems. The complete absence of medical knowledge among pirate crews meant that diseases that might have been treatable were left to run their course unchecked. Pirates had no understanding of germs, infection, or proper medical care. Their treatments were based on superstition, folklore, and desperation rather than any scientific knowledge. Common cures included bloodletting, which only weakened patients further, drinking rum mixed with gunpowder, and applying various plant extracts that often did more harm than good. When pirates did attempt medical treatment, the results were often worse than the original disease. They would use dirty knives to cut open wounds, believing this would release bad humors from the body. They would force sick crew members to drink mixtures of rum, seawater, and various toxic substances. They would sometimes try to burn out infections with hot metal tools, causing severe burns and additional infection. Amputations were common aboard pirate ships, usually performed with crude tools and no anesthesia other than alcohol. Pirates would hold down victims while ship's carpenters who doubled as surgeons would hack off infected limbs with saws and knives. The mortality rate from these crude surgeries was extremely high, as infection would almost always set in afterward. Those who survived amputations were often left with stumps that never healed properly and would continue to cause pain and infection for the rest of their lives. Parasites were a constant problem aboard pirate ships, with lice, fleas, and intestinal worms affecting virtually every crew member. Pirates would be covered in insect bites that would become infected from constant scratching. They would suffer from severe itching that would drive them to distraction, and many would scratch themselves bloody trying to find relief. Intestinal worms would cause malnutrition, stomach pain, and diarrhea, further weakening pirates who were already struggling with poor nutrition. The psychological toll of living constantly surrounded by disease and death was enormous. Pirates would watch their crewmates waste away from various illnesses, knowing that they would likely suffer the same fate. The fear of disease was constant and well-founded. Every cough, fever, or stomachache could be the beginning of a death sentence. This constant stress weakened immune systems and made pirates even more susceptible to illness. Mental illness was also common among pirates, though it was little understood at the time. The combination of poor nutrition, constant stress, social isolation, and traumatic experiences would often drive men to madness. Pirates would sometimes become catatonic, refusing to eat or respond to their surroundings. Others would become violently paranoid, attacking crewmates they believed were plotting against them. Many would talk to imaginary companions or claim to see dead crew members walking around the ship. The handling of dead bodies aboard pirate ships created additional health hazards. When crew members died, their bodies would often be left on deck for days before being disposed of, as the crew might be too sick or too busy to deal with them immediately. The decomposing corpses would attract flies and other insects, further spreading disease throughout the ship. When bodies were finally disposed of, they were usually just thrown overboard, but sometimes pieces would wash back onto the ship or become tangled in the rigging. Some pirate crews practiced a form of quarantine by abandoning sick crew members on deserted islands, but this was more about protecting the healthy crew members than caring for the sick. Pirates who were left behind on islands would almost certainly die alone, either from their illness or from starvation and exposure. This practice added psychological horror to physical suffering, as pirates knew that becoming seriously ill meant being abandoned by their comrades. The end result was that disease killed far more pirates than violence ever did. Most pirate crews lost more than half their members to illness within the first year of sailing together. The survivors were often so weakened by disease and malnutrition that they were barely functional as fighters or sailors. The romantic image of strong, healthy pirates conquering the seas was pure fantasy. The reality was groups of diseased, malnourished men barely clinging to life while their bodies fell apart around them. Death from disease aboard a pirate ship was never quick or merciful. It was a prolonged, agonizing process that could take weeks or months to complete. Pirates would waste away gradually, their bodies consuming themselves in a desperate attempt to survive. They would remain conscious and aware of their deteriorating condition until the very end, often begging for death to release them from their suffering. The lucky ones died in their sleep. The unlucky ones remained awake and alert as their organs failed and their bodies shut down system by system. Violence aboard a pirate ship wasn't an occasional eruption of tempers or a dramatic sword fight between honorable enemies. It was a constant, grinding reality that permeated every aspect of daily life. These floating prisons were pressure cookers of human misery where desperate, malnourished, and diseased men were forced to live in impossibly close quarters with no escape from each other's company. The result was an environment where brutality wasn't just common, it was essential for survival. The weak were preyed upon mercilessly. The strong ruled through fear and intimidation, and everyone lived in constant terror of becoming the next victim. The hierarchy aboard a pirate ship was enforced through systematic cruelty that would make medieval torture chambers seem civilized by comparison. At the top of this brutal pyramid was the captain, a position that was less about leadership and more about being the most successful practitioner of violence and intimidation. Pirate captains didn't earn their positions through noble qualities or democratic ideals. They clawed their way to power by proving they were more ruthless, more cunning, and more willing to commit atrocities than anyone else aboard the ship. The captain's authority was maintained through a careful balance of fear, favor, and strategic violence. He had to be brutal enough to cow potential challengers while being clever enough to avoid creating martyrs or united opposition. A pirate captain who showed weakness would be dead within days, either killed outright by ambitious subordinates or voted out of office and abandoned on a deserted island. The position required constant vigilance, as every crew member was a potential assassin waiting for the right moment to strike. Beneath the captain were the officers, the quartermaster, boatswain, and other specialists who helped run the ship. These positions were also won and held through violence, though it was often more subtle than the crude brutality used to control ordinary crew members. Officers would form alliances, make deals, and engage in complex political maneuvering, while being ready to kill each other at a moment's notice. Trust was a luxury that no pirate could afford, especially those in positions of authority. The punishment systems aboard pirate ships were designed to be public spectacles that would terrorize the crew into submission while providing entertainment for men who had few other diversions. Flogging was the most common punishment, but it wasn't the relatively civilized version practiced in official navies. Pirate floggings were savage affairs where victims could receive hundreds of lashes that would strip the flesh from their backs and often prove fatal. The whips used were often modified with pieces of metal, glass, or bone that would tear through skin and muscle with each stroke. Keelhauling was perhaps the most feared punishment in the pirate arsenal. This involved tying a victim to a rope and dragging them under the ship from one side to the other. The barnacles and sharp edges on the ship's hull would tear the victim's flesh away as they were pulled through the water, assuming they didn't drown first. Most victims of keelhauling died during the process, and those who survived were left with horrific injuries that usually became infected and killed them anyway. The punishment was often used for relatively minor infractions, as the goal was to terrorize the crew rather than to fit the punishment to the crime. Marooning was another common punishment that was essentially a death sentence disguised as mercy. Pirates who violated the ship's rules or fell out of favor with the captain would be abandoned on deserted islands with minimal supplies. They would be given a pistol with a single shot, supposedly to defend themselves but actually to commit suicide when starvation and thirst came unbearable. Some marooned pirates would try to survive by eating whatever they could find: seaweed, insects, even their own leather clothing, but most died within weeks of being abandoned. The violence aboard pirate ships wasn't limited to formal punishments. Casual brutality was a daily occurrence as crew members fought over food, sleeping spaces, and personal belongings. Men would be beaten, stabbed, or thrown overboard for minor disagreements or imagined slights. The constant stress, malnutrition, and disease made pirates quick to anger and prone to explosive violence over trivial matters. A dispute over a piece of moldy bread could escalate to murder within minutes. Sexual violence was also common aboard pirate ships, though it's rarely mentioned in romanticized accounts of pirate life. Younger or weaker crew members were often victimized by stronger pirates, and there was no authority to appeal to for protection. The victims of sexual assault had no recourse and no escape. They were trapped aboard the ship with their attackers until they died, were killed, or managed to escape during a port visit. Many young men who joined pirate crews were essentially sold into sexual slavery by their captors. The treatment of prisoners captured during pirate raids was uniformly horrific. Pirates would torture captives to extract information about hidden valuables or simply for entertainment. They would use red-hot irons to burn victims, break their bones with hammers, or flay the skin from their bodies while they were still alive. Some pirates specialized in creative forms of torture, competing to see who could devise the most inventive ways to inflict pain and terror. Women prisoners faced particularly horrible fates. They would be raped repeatedly by multiple crew members, often while being tortured simultaneously. Many were killed after being abused, but some were kept alive as long as they provided entertainment for the crew. Female prisoners had no hope of rescue or escape. They were completely at the mercy of men who had no mercy to give. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones endured weeks or months of abuse before finally being murdered or dying from their injuries. The psychological effects of constant exposure to violence were devastating. Pirates became desensitized to human suffering and death, viewing brutality as normal and necessary parts of life. They would laugh at the screams of torture victims and place bets on how long prisoners would survive various forms of abuse. The capacity for empathy and compassion was beaten out of them by the harsh realities of their existence, leaving behind men who were barely recognizable as human beings. Competition for resources led to constant conflict among crew members. Pirates would fight over portions of food, access to drinking water, and sleeping spaces. These fights were often brutal affairs, where men would use knives, clubs, or whatever weapons were available to settle their disputes. The concept of sharing or cooperation was foreign to most pirates. They had learned that showing weakness or generosity would only make them targets for exploitation. The ship's officers used divide-and-conquer tactics to maintain control over the crew. They would play crew members against each other, encouraging rivalries and conflicts that would prevent united opposition to their authority. Officers would show favoritism to some crew members while persecuting others, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that made organized resistance nearly impossible. Gambling was another source of constant violence aboard pirate ships. Pirates would bet on everything: dice games, card games, fights between crew members, or how long prisoners would survive torture. These gambling sessions often erupted into violence when accusations of cheating arose or when debts couldn't be paid. Men would literally bet their lives on the turn of a card, and losers would sometimes be killed immediately to settle their debts. The arms carried by pirates were often used against fellow crew members as much as against enemies. Knives, cutlasses, and pistols were constantly being drawn in disputes between pirates. The close quarters of the ship made these weapons even more dangerous, as a single gunshot or sword thrust could easily hit innocent bystanders. Many pirates carried multiple weapons because they knew they might need to defend themselves against their own crewmates at any moment. Mutiny was always a possibility aboard pirate ships, but it was a desperate gamble that usually ended in massacre for one side or the other. Successful mutinies were rare because they required careful coordination among men who couldn't trust each other. More often, attempted mutinies were discovered before they could be carried out, leading to mass executions as the captain and loyal officers sought to eliminate any potential threats to their authority. The planning of a mutiny was itself dangerous, as any crew member could betray the conspirators in hopes of gaining favor with the officers. Pirates would sometimes pretend to join mutiny plots only to reveal them at the last moment, earning rewards and protection from the ship's leadership. This constant atmosphere of suspicion made it nearly impossible for oppressed crew members to organize effective resistance to their tormentors. When mutinies did succeed, they often led to even more violence, as the new leadership sought to eliminate supporters of the old regime. The ship would be cleansed of enemies through mass executions, and the cycle of brutality would begin anew under different management. There was no escape from the violence. It was an inherent part of the pirate system that consumed everyone it touched. The treatment of new crew members was particularly brutal, as experienced pirates would test the newcomers' resolve through various forms of hazing and abuse. New recruits would be forced to prove their worthiness through acts of violence against prisoners or by enduring punishment without complaint. Those who showed weakness or squeamishness would be marked as victims and subjected to constant abuse until they either toughened up or were killed. Pirates also engaged in ritualistic violence that served to bond the crew together through shared brutality. They would participate in group torture sessions, collective rape of prisoners, and mass executions that made every crew member complicit in the atrocities. These rituals served to break down individual moral boundaries and create a twisted sense of brotherhood based on shared guilt and mutual dependence. The constant threat of violence affected every aspect of daily life aboard pirate ships. Men slept with weapons close at hand and never fully relaxed their guard. They ate quickly and defensively, knowing that showing weakness or distraction could make them targets. They formed temporary alliances based on mutual protection rather than friendship, and these partnerships could dissolve into violence at any moment if circumstances changed. Medical treatment, such as it was, often involved violence as well. Crude surgery was performed without anesthesia, with patients being held down by force while ship's carpenters hacked off infected limbs or attempted to remove bullets and shrapnel. Many pirates preferred to let wounds go untreated rather than submit to the brutal medical procedures available to them. The psychological impact of living in constant fear of violence was enormous. Pirates developed hair-trigger tempers and paranoid mindsets that made them dangerous to everyone around them. They would interpret innocent comments as threats and respond with deadly force to perceived slights. The stress of living under constant threat of attack made many pirates mentally unstable and prone to sudden explosive outbursts of violence. Eventually, the cycle of violence would consume the pirates themselves. Most pirate crews were eventually destroyed not by external enemies, but by internal conflicts that tore them apart from within. The very brutality that pirates used to maintain order would eventually spiral out of control, leading to massacres that would leave ships full of corpses and survivors too traumatized to continue their criminal activities. The violence aboard pirate ships wasn't romantic or heroic. It was ugly, senseless, and ultimately self-destructive. It created monsters out of men and turned what might have been communities of outcasts into charnel houses of human misery. The pirates who survived this environment were forever changed by it, carrying physical and psychological scars that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, assuming they lived long enough to leave the pirate life behind. The daily routine aboard a pirate ship was a grinding cycle of misery that slowly destroyed men's souls as surely as disease destroyed their bodies. There was no such thing as a typical day, because every moment was a struggle for survival against the elements, the ship's conditions, and their fellow crew members. The romantic notion of pirates living carefree lives of adventure was utterly false. These men existed in a state of constant anxiety, boredom, and desperation that drove many of them to complete mental breakdown. Dawn aboard a pirate ship brought no relief from the horrors of the night. Men would wake to find that crew members had died during the darkness, their corpses stiffening in the tropical heat or frozen solid in northern waters. The living would have to deal with these bodies, either throwing them overboard or, in desperate times, preparing them for consumption. There was no reverence for the dead, no time for mourning. Death was so common that it had become mundane. Just another unpleasant task to be handled as efficiently as possible. The first priority of each day was assessing what had gone wrong during the night. Pirates would check for new leaks in the hull, inspect the rigging for storm damage, and count their supplies to see what had been spoiled, stolen, or consumed by rats. This daily inventory of deterioration was deeply demoralizing, as it provided constant reminders that their situation was always getting worse, never better. Every morning brought fresh evidence that their ship was falling apart. Their supplies were dwindling, and their chances of survival were diminishing. Water rationing was a daily source of conflict and despair. Each crew member might receive a few ounces of contaminated, foul-smelling water that had to last them for the entire day. This meager ration was barely enough to prevent immediate death from dehydration, let alone provide comfort or satisfaction. Pirates would jealously guard their water allowance, hiding it from other crew members who might try to steal it. The constant thirst was maddening, made worse by the fact that they were surrounded by undrinkable seawater that would kill them if consumed in any significant quantity. The distribution of food was another daily ordeal that highlighted the crew's desperation. The cook, usually one of the most hated men aboard the ship, would ladle out portions of whatever rotten provisions were available. Pirates would examine their food carefully, picking out the larger maggots and pieces of mold, while preparing to force down whatever remained. Arguments would break out over portion sizes, with stronger crew members often stealing food from weaker ones. The sick and injured received the smallest portions, as they were seen as less valuable to the ship's operation and therefore less deserving of precious resources. Work assignments were distributed based on a complex hierarchy of favoritism, fear, and capability. The most dangerous jobs, climbing the rigging in storms, working in the bilge, or handling the sick, were given to the weakest crew members or those who had fallen out of favor with the officers. These assignments were often death sentences, as pirates forced to work in dangerous conditions without proper equipment or support rarely survived for long. The maintenance of the ship was a constant, Sisyphean task that consumed enormous amounts of time and energy while producing minimal results. Pirates would spend hours patching leaks that would reopen within days, repairing sails that would tear again in the next storm, and pumping bilge water that would immediately begin accumulating again. This endless cycle of futile labor was psychologically devastating, as crew members could see that their efforts were meaningless but had no choice but to continue working or face punishment. Boredom was perhaps more destructive to pirate morale than any physical hardship. During long periods at sea with no targets to attack and nothing productive to accomplish, pirates would sink into deep depressions that could last for weeks. They had no books to read, no games to play, and no entertainment beyond the crude diversions they could create themselves. Some would whittle pieces of wood into crude sculptures. Others would tell stories that became more outlandish with each retelling. But most simply stared at the horizon and slowly lost their minds. The lack of mental stimulation led to increasingly bizarre behavior among crew members. Some pirates would talk to imaginary companions for hours, carrying on detailed conversations with people who existed only in their deteriorating minds. Others would become obsessed with meaningless tasks, spending entire days counting barnacles on the ship's hull or arranging rope coils in precise patterns. These behaviors were early signs of the complete mental breakdowns that awaited many long-term pirates. Sleep was another daily struggle that provided little relief from the horrors of waking life. Pirates would collapse from exhaustion on whatever hard surface was available, but genuine rest was rare. The constant motion of the ship, the overwhelming stench, The sounds of sick crew members vomiting or crying out in pain, and the ever-present fear of attack made peaceful sleep nearly impossible. Many pirates suffered from chronic insomnia that left them walking through their days in a haze of exhaustion and confusion. When pirates did manage to fall asleep, they were often tormented by nightmares that reflected their waking reality. They would dream of drowning in bilge water, being eaten alive by rats, or watching their crewmates die in increasingly horrible ways. Some would wake up screaming, adding to the cacophony of misery that filled the ship during the dark hours. Others would thrash about violently in their sleep, injuring themselves or others in the confined spaces where they rested. The social dynamics aboard pirate ships were toxic relationships that poisoned every human interaction. Pirates couldn't trust anyone completely, as even close friends might betray each other for a share of food or water. Alliances were temporary and based on mutual fear rather than genuine affection. Men who had once been friends would turn against each other over trivial disputes, and yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's murderer over something as simple as a perceived slight or a contested sleeping spot. Conversation among pirates was limited to basic communications about ship operations, complaints about conditions, and increasingly paranoid discussions about who might be plotting against whom. There was no intellectual discourse, no philosophical reflection, and no emotional support. Pirates had forgotten how to relate to each other as human beings and instead treated their crewmates as potential threats, competitors for resources, or tools to be used for personal survival. The absence of women created additional psychological pressure that manifested in various disturbing ways. Some pirates would become obsessed with female prisoners, developing twisted emotional attachments to women they were simultaneously torturing and abusing. Others would direct their frustrated sexual energy toward weaker male crew members, creating additional layers of violence and exploitation. The complete absence of normal human relationships left pirates emotionally stunted and incapable of forming healthy connections with other people. Personal hygiene became impossible to maintain, which had profound psychological effects beyond the obvious physical discomfort. Pirates would watch their own bodies deteriorating, their teeth falling out, their skin becoming covered in sores and infections, their hair becoming matted with filth and parasites. This physical degradation was deeply demoralizing and contributed to feelings of worthlessness and despair that many pirates never recovered from. The concept of privacy was completely foreign aboard pirate ships, and this constant exposure to other people's misery was psychologically devastating. Pirates would witness every intimate detail of their crewmates' suffering, listening to them vomit, watching them soil themselves when sick with dysentery, seeing them cry out in pain from infected wounds. This forced intimacy with human degradation created a shared trauma that bonded crews together in the most unhealthy ways possible. Mental illness was common and completely misunderstood by pirate crews. Pirates who suffered nervous breakdowns were often seen as possessed by demons or cursed by supernatural forces. They might be beaten in attempts to drive out evil spirits, abandoned on islands as punishment for bringing bad luck to the ship, or simply thrown overboard if they became too disruptive. There was no concept of mental health care or compassion for psychological suffering. Some pirates developed elaborate superstitions and rituals in desperate attempts to exert some control over their chaotic existence. They would perform complicated ceremonies before battles, create lucky charms from pieces of rope or metal, or develop obsessive behaviors that they believed would protect them from harm. These rituals provided some psychological comfort, but often became compulsions that consumed increasing amounts of time and mental energy. The absence of any meaningful future goals beyond basic survival created an existential despair that permeated daily life aboard pirate ships. Pirates couldn't plan for retirement, couldn't dream of returning to normal society, and couldn't envision any positive outcome to their current situation. They lived entirely in the present moment, focused only on making it through another day without dying. This lack of hope for the future created a nihilistic mindset that made pirates capable of any atrocity, as they had nothing left to lose. Drug and alcohol abuse was rampant among pirates, who had access to substances that might temporarily numb their psychological pain. They would drink rum until they passed out, smoke opium when available, or consume any other mind-altering substances they could acquire through trade or theft. These binges provided temporary escape from their misery but often led to additional problems, including increased violence, impaired judgment during critical situations, and conflicts over access to limited supplies of drugs and alcohol. The constant exposure to violence and death created post-traumatic stress symptoms that would plague pirates for the rest of their lives. They would experience flashbacks to particularly brutal incidents, suffer from hypervigilance that made them jump at every unexpected sound, and develop hair-trigger tempers that could explode into deadly violence over minor provocation. Many pirates became unable to function in normal social situations, as they had been conditioned to view every human interaction as a potential threat. Paranoia was endemic among pirate crews, as there were usually genuine reasons to be suspicious of other crew members. Pirates would become convinced that their crewmates were plotting against them, poisoning their food, or planning to kill them in their sleep. These suspicions were often accurate, which made the paranoia even more damaging to mental health. Pirates lived in a state of constant alertness, exhausting themselves mentally and emotionally, as they tried to stay one step ahead of potential betrayers. The degradation of language and communication skills was another sign of psychological deterioration among long-term pirates. Men who had once been articulate would gradually lose their ability to express complex thoughts or emotions. Their vocabulary would shrink to basic commands and curses, and many would go for days without engaging in meaningful conversation. This intellectual decline reflected the broader dehumanization that occurred when men were forced to live like animals for extended periods. Time became meaningless aboard pirate ships, as there were no regular schedules, no weekends or holidays, and no clear markers to distinguish one day from another. Pirates would lose track of dates, seasons, and even years, living in an eternal present of misery that seemed to stretch on forever. This temporal disorientation added to their sense of being lost and disconnected from the normal world that most people inhabited. The psychological impact of committing atrocities was enormous, even for men who had been hardened by desperate circumstances. Pirates who tortured prisoners or participated in massacres would often suffer from guilt and shame that manifested as depression, anxiety, and self-destructive behavior. Some would try to justify their actions by convincing themselves that their victims deserved their fate, while others would sink into despair over what they had become. Eventually, most pirates reached a point of complete psychological breakdown, where they were no longer capable of rational thought or normal human behavior. They would become zombies, going through the motions of their daily routines while their minds retreated into fantasy worlds or simply shut down entirely. These broken men were often the most dangerous crew members, as they had nothing left to lose and no capacity for making rational decisions about their actions. The daily life of a pirate was not an adventure or a romantic escape from civilization. It was a descent into madness that destroyed everything human about the men who chose or were forced into this way of life. The psychological scars left by pirate existence were often more devastating than the physical injuries, creating damaged individuals who could never fully return to normal society even if they somehow managed to escape their floating prisons. The ultimate fate of most pirates was neither glorious nor romantic. It was a pathetic end to lives that had been reduced to barely human existence. The popular image of pirates retiring to tropical islands with their fortunes is pure fantasy. The reality was that these men died young, violent deaths or lived just long enough to become broken, diseased wrecks who served as warnings to others about the true cost of choosing piracy as a way of life. Their stories didn't end with triumphant victories or peaceful retirements. They ended with rope, sword, disease, or madness claiming lives that had been brutally short and filled with unspeakable suffering. The average lifespan of a pirate from the moment they joined a crew until their death was approximately 18 months. This wasn't death from old age or natural causes. It was death from violence, disease, starvation, drowning, or execution. The few pirates who managed to survive longer than 2 years were usually so physically and mentally damaged that they barely resembled the men they had once been. They were walking testimonies to the destructive power of the pirate lifestyle, their broken bodies and shattered minds serving as cautionary tales for anyone considering following in their footsteps. Disease killed far more pirates than warfare ever did. Scurvy alone probably accounted for more pirate deaths than all the naval battles, mutinies, and executions combined. The combination of malnutrition, contaminated water, poor sanitation, and overcrowding created perfect conditions for epidemic diseases that would sweep through pirate crews like wildfire. Ships that started voyages with crews of 100 men might return to port with fewer than 20 survivors. And even those survivors were often so weakened by illness that they died shortly after reaching land. The pirates who managed to escape disease often fell victim to violence from their own crewmates. The constant tension, competition for resources, and absence of any civilizing influences created environments where murder was commonplace and often went unpunished. Pirates would kill each other over portions of food, sleeping spaces, shares of loot, or simply because they were bored and looking for entertainment. Many pirate ships became floating slaughterhouses where crew members were more likely to be killed by their colleagues than by external enemies. Those pirates who avoided both disease and internal violence still faced the constant threat of death from the sea itself. Wooden ships in the age of sail were inherently dangerous, and pirate vessels were often poorly maintained, overloaded, and sailed by inexperienced crews. Storms could sink ships within minutes. Fires could consume vessels in the time it took to say a prayer, and mechanical failures could leave crews stranded in the middle of the ocean with no hope of rescue. Many pirates simply disappeared without a trace, their ships and crews swallowed by the sea and forgotten by history. The lucky pirates who managed to survive long enough to be captured by authorities usually faced execution, but even this was often preferable to continuing their existence aboard pirate ships. Public hangings were common, and these events were treated as entertainment by colonial populations who saw pirates as both fascinating and terrifying figures. The condemned pirates often welcomed death as an escape from lives that had become unbearable, and many went to the gallows with relief rather than fear. The famous pirate trial records that survive from the early 18th century provide glimpses into the real experiences of these men, and they paint a picture that is utterly different from the romanticized version popularized by fiction. Pirates testified about watching their crewmates die from starvation, about being forced to eat human flesh to survive, about living in conditions so foul that death seemed like mercy. These weren't swashbuckling adventurers. They were broken men describing lives of unimaginable hardship and degradation. Even the most successful pirate captains, the ones whose names have survived in historical records, met inglorious ends that reflected the ultimate futility of their chosen profession. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, was killed in battle by British naval forces, his head cut off and hung from the bowsprit of his captor's ship as a warning to other pirates. His crew was scattered, killed, or captured, and his supposedly vast treasure was never found because it probably never existed in the first place. Bartholomew Roberts, considered one of the most successful pirates of his era, was killed by grapeshot during a naval engagement, his body thrown overboard by his crew to prevent it from being displayed as a trophy. His death marked the end of his crew's activities, as the survivors were quickly captured and either executed or transported to penal colonies where they died in chains. The man who had supposedly captured over 400 ships died owning nothing but the clothes on his back and a reputation that brought him no comfort in his final moments. Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The two most famous female pirates ended their careers in Jamaican jails awaiting execution. Both claimed to be pregnant to delay their hanging, and while Mary Read died in prison before her sentence could be carried out, Anne Bonny simply disappeared from historical records, probably dying in obscurity after being released or transported. Their brief careers as pirates had lasted only a few months, during which they experienced the same horrors as their male counterparts, with the additional burden of sexual violence and exploitation. The treasure that pirates supposedly accumulated was largely mythical. Most pirate attacks yielded little of value beyond basic supplies and small amounts of currency. The idea of buried treasure chests, filled with gold and jewels, comes from a few exceptional cases that were wildly exaggerated over time. Pirates lived hand to mouth, spending whatever they acquired immediately on necessities or losing it to other crew members. The average pirate died owning less than a common sailor in the merchant marine. The few pirates who did manage to acquire significant wealth usually lost it quickly through gambling, drinking, or simply having it stolen by their associates. There were no banks that would serve pirates, no safe places to store valuables, and no legitimate ways to convert stolen goods into usable currency. Pirates were essentially homeless criminals, with no permanent address and no way to secure their possessions against theft or loss. The impact of piracy on maritime trade was significant, but not in the way that romantic legends suggest. Pirates didn't pose a serious military threat to established naval powers. They were more like maritime terrorists who attacked vulnerable merchant vessels and then fled to avoid confrontation with warships. Their activities did disrupt trade routes and increase insurance costs, but they were more of a nuisance than a genuine threat to international commerce. The British Royal Navy's campaign against piracy in the early 18th century was remarkably successful precisely because pirates were not the formidable opponents that fiction has made them out to be. Most pirate crews consisted of sick, malnourished, poorly armed men sailing on ships that were barely seaworthy. When confronted by professional naval forces with trained crews, proper equipment, and disciplined tactics, pirates usually surrendered quickly or were defeated decisively. The myth of pirate democracy and egalitarian principles was another fabrication that bore no resemblance to reality. Pirate crews were not enlightened societies that treated all members fairly. They were tyrannical hierarchies where the strong preyed upon the weak without mercy. The pirate codes that supposedly governed crew behavior were basic survival mechanisms designed to prevent crews from killing each other before they could complete their criminal enterprises, not noble principles based on justice or equality. The romantic image of pirates as rebels fighting against oppressive governments is equally false. Most pirates had no political agenda beyond basic survival and immediate gratification. They attacked ships of all nations indiscriminately, including vessels from their own countries. They weren't revolutionaries or freedom fighters. They were opportunistic criminals who took advantage of the vast distances and limited law enforcement capabilities of the colonial era. The psychological damage inflicted by the pirate lifestyle was often permanent and irreversible. Pirates who managed to escape their crews and return to normal society frequently found themselves unable to readjust to civilian life. They suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, and violent outbursts that made them dangerous to themselves and others. Many became alcoholics or drug addicts in attempts to self-medicate their psychological pain. Former pirates who tried to reintegrate into society often found themselves shunned and feared by their communities. Their reputations preceded them, and few people were willing to employ or associate with men who had been involved in piracy. This social isolation often drove former pirates back to criminal activities. as they had no legitimate means of supporting themselves and no social networks to provide assistance or guidance. The few ex-pirates who did manage to build new lives for themselves usually had to completely reinvent their identities, moving to distant locations where their pasts were unknown and creating fictional personal histories that bore no resemblance to their actual experiences. They lived in constant fear of discovery, knowing that their previous associations with piracy could lead to prosecution, social ostracism, or vigilante justice. The impact of piracy on families and communities was devastating in ways that are rarely acknowledged in popular culture. Pirates weren't just criminals who stole money. They were murderers, rapists, and terrorists who destroyed countless lives during their brief careers. The wives and children of merchant sailors killed by pirates were left destitute, with no social safety net to support them. Entire communities could be ruined by a single pirate attack that destroyed their primary means of economic support. The colonial authorities' responses to piracy were often as brutal as the pirates themselves. Suspected pirates were frequently tortured during interrogation, held in appalling prison conditions while awaiting trial, and executed in public spectacles designed to terrorize potential criminals. The legal system that dealt with piracy was rough justice at best, with many innocent men probably executed alongside genuine criminals. The economic impact of piracy extended far beyond the immediate losses from stolen cargo. Maritime insurance rates increased dramatically in areas where pirates operated, making trade more expensive and reducing the profitability of legitimate commerce. Some trade routes were abandoned entirely when the risk of pirate attack became too great, isolating communities and restricting economic development. Modern piracy, while different in scale and methods, shares many characteristics with its historical predecessor. Contemporary pirates in places like Somalia and Southeast Asia are often driven by the same desperation and lack of alternatives that motivated their historical counterparts. They live violent, dangerous lives with little hope of long-term success, and most end up dead, imprisoned, or living as fugitives. The romanticization of historical piracy has done a disservice to our understanding of this phenomenon and its impact on human society. By transforming brutal criminals into charming rogues, popular culture has obscured the real suffering caused by piracy and made it harder to understand the social and economic factors that drive people toward maritime crime. The reality of pirate life was not an adventure story. It was a horror story about what happens when civilization breaks down and desperate people turn to violence as a means of survival. The lesson of historical piracy is not that some people are born to be criminals, but that extreme social and economic conditions can drive ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence and degradation. The pirates of the Golden Age were not inherently evil. They were products of a system that offered them no legitimate opportunities for advancement and no social safety net to catch them when they fell. Their stories serve as warnings about what can happen when societies fail to provide adequate opportunities and support for their most vulnerable members. The true legacy of piracy is not the romantic adventures celebrated in fiction, but the countless lives destroyed by this brutal way of life. Every pirate who died from disease, violence, or execution was someone's son, brother, or father, whose life was cut short by circumstances that pushed them beyond the boundaries of civilized society. Their suffering and death should be remembered not as entertainment, but as tragedy, a reminder of the human cost of desperation and the importance of creating societies that offer hope and opportunity to all their members. In the end, piracy was not a romantic escape from the constraints of civilization. It was a descent into hell that consumed everyone it touched. The men who chose or were forced into this way of life paid a terrible price for their brief taste of supposed freedom, and most would have gladly traded their pirate careers for the chance to live ordinary, peaceful lives on solid ground. Their stories are not adventures to be celebrated, but cautionary tales about the dangers of abandoning the principles and institutions that make civilized life possible.